This short reflection, which could really be the first of many, is a bit of an overview of the important work of Richard Wagner and his classic work, The Ring of the Nibelung. Richard Wagner, like Friedrich Nietzsche, like Heidegger, like many others, has often been maligned, caricatured, misunderstood. But his great play, The Ring of the Nibelung, was one of the most significant philosophic operas, theological operas of the 19th century. It continues to be played in Beirut, Germany, and it's almost impossible to get tickets because it remains one of the most significant plays in Western history. And the underlying background of it continues to hold people. And back of it, of course, is one of the great tensions in how we come to know and make sense of our all too human journey. Is it through abstraction, logical arguments, inductive reasoning, premise, conclusion, empirical analysis, a certain notion of science, or is it through myth? Is it through story? Is it through parable? And one of the great tensions within the human journey, as well as in Western civilization, is between what's called the rationalist tradition and the romantic tradition. The romantic tradition, in to some degree, critiquing elements of the misuse of reason, held high the importance of myth, of story, of drama, of all of these alternate ways of seeing and knowing in which most can understand a story and how it relates to them in their journey. And Richard Wagner, in The Ring of the Nibelung, which has some affinities with Tolkien's Lord of the Rings, they're both drawing from the mother lode of the Nordic tradition and its impact not only on Scandinavian, Northern Europe civilization, but the perennial themes in these stories transcend, of course, a particular ethnic, linguistic background. Their themes are perennial, and that's what makes such plays significant. Important to note that C.S. Lewis, in his autobiography, Surprised by Joy, chapter 5, The Renaissance, articulates in an ongoing way the significance of Wagner, The Ring of the Nibelung, and Arthur Rachman's illustrations of this significant play. The illustrations by Rachman are powerful, they're raw, they're graphic, they take you right into the energy and dynamism of Wagner's Ring of the Nibelung in its 4 acts. On the other hand, you'll get someone like Friedrich Nietzsche. His first significant work, The Birth of Tragedy, is very indebted to Wagner and The Ring of the Nibelung. What Nietzsche was doing was trying to argue that unlike comedy, Greek comedy and the Apollonian way of knowing, the rational, the positive, the optimistic end, there was in Greek thought also the Dionysian, also the tragic element, and Nietzsche was trying to bring the two together, the Apollonian positive, comedic, as well as the Dionysian tragic. But he draws deeply from Richard Wagner's The Ring of the Nibelung, which was just emerging at this time, and Nietzsche knew the Wagners, Richard Wagner and Cosima, and he spent a great deal of time with them in his early years, initially at Tribschen and then at Beirut also, as The Ring of the Nibelung was emerging. So one could hardly imagine, to some degree, a C.S. Lewis and a Friedrich Nietzsche on the same page, but they both dipped their buckets in the mother lode in the well of The Ring of the Nibelung, Lohengrin, Perceval, these plays as well. Another important thinker on the stage died just a couple of years ago is Roger Scruton, very much honored, respected by conservatives. He's done 2 books on Nordic myth, and particularly Wagner and The Ring of the Nibelung, as well as Perceval, Lohengrin, arguing the myths that Wagner internalized, articulated in The Ring of the Nibelung and other works, have a perennial appeal for the human journey. What you also get in this Nordic tradition, which can come as a bit of a critique, a counter to perhaps our all too triumphalistic tendency in the affluent West, is the tragic dimension. And so The Ring of the Nibelung doesn't particularly end positively at one level. Siegfried and Brunhilde both die, and these are the major protagonists. Brunhilde is probably more the protagonist than Siegfried, but it's not necessarily a happy ending, a comedic ending, unlike, for example, Tolkien's Lord of the Rings or The Hobbit or C.S. Lewis's Chronicles of Narnia or Harry Potter. Many of these dramas, these epic dramas, tend to end in a positive. The good is victorious, the evil is defeated, and we can all go to bed and sleep well at night because that's how the universe unfolds morally. But in fact, what Wagner is going to articulate, and he draws deeply from elements of this Nordic tradition, which is also grounded in the Greek tradition of the tragic, which argues very clearly in the Greek tradition, and Nietzsche was drawn more to Aeschylus than he was to Sophocles or Euripides. And he's going to argue that, in fact, to ignore this way of life in the midst of the human journey and the human struggle, in fact, is to deny a very significant aspect of reality, that just because women and men try to live the good life in a meaningful sense and face the opposition and face the challenges of their time does not mean the story will end well. It can end tragically, it can end sadly, there can be much suffering. And so you get this counter in the best of Greek Teutonic myth that is willing to balance the Apollonian comedic with the Dionysian tragic, and living in that tension is not easy, but at least it comes as a corrective to a distortion, a sort of a moral distortion, that if a person in thought, word, and deed attempts to live well, think well, and therefore the end of the story is going to end, sort of a Walt Disney ending in that sense. And so the Greek tragic, the Wagnerian approach, comes as a check, a counter, a corrective to this lack of meaningful tension being lived in between ways of understanding the heroic, the epic life, and then the end of trying to live this sort of life. I mean, even in Christianity, we get, yes, Christ is crucified, but you get the resurrection in time. So in that sense, it's like Dante, it's a divine comedy, it's a good ending in time. But the Greek Teutonic tradition argues, is that always the fate that people live with? But to the Ring of the Nibelung itself, and I'll briefly go over it, and perhaps in further reflections, I can delve a little more deeply into each of the four acts. The first act is the Rhine Maidens, and the Rhine Maidens are the protectors of gold in the Rhine. And as long as that gold is protected and people do not have access to it, to some degree there is harmony, there is peace in the world. But Elberich is a Nibelung. They're the dwarves, or the people who love gold. He's someone who lusts for money, for power. Now, the gold in the Rhine that the Rhine Maidens protect, is their position is that to have the gold, to have a ring, means you have to forgo love for power. Alberic lusts for power. He wants control. So he stealthily goes into the Rhine, and the Rhine Maidens tease him, they cavort with him. And of course, what you have going on here is Alberic increasingly feeling rejected, marginalized, not understood. And his reaction is, if I cannot be accepted, then I must have the power, so I will be the one who shapes the future, the destiny of all. So often what happens to people when they're marginalized, rejected, one is just to retreat from the fray, the other is, I will get the power that is needed. I will forgo love, forgo human relationships, and I will use the power that I lust after, so that no one will ever reject me again. They will always fear me. And so Alberic, in the initial, really Act 1 of the four parts story of the Ring of the Nibelung, steals the gold from the Rhine Maidens and flees up into the above the Rhine itself. Meanwhile, what you also have happening in this part 1 of the Rhine Maidens is increasingly so Odin. So you've got actually two almost levels, interesting levels of reality in the the ring of the Nibelung. So the Nibelungs are under the earth. They're sort of crude, power hungry, wanting to control. And then you have the gods. So Valhalla and Odin or Wotan, and they're trying to build kingdoms of power and law and order. So like the state in that sense, they're the ones who usher the commands. They're the ones who bring security, predictability. They look down on the Alberics, the Nibelungs. They're the lower classes in that sense. Valhalla is the position in that sense in which you have politics and order and predictability and security. But Odin is quite willing, the one who keeps the gods alive. And I might add, this is very important because at the final part of the Ring of the Nibelung, it's called the Twilight of the Gods. What's happening in the 19th century is very, very much questioning, is there a god? Or if there is, whose version of the gods in that sense? And whose version of the gods must die? And so what Wagner is doing in the Ring of the Nibelung, he's asking the big question is there a time for our notions of the gods to die? Are we living in the twilight of a certain interpretation of the gods? And Odin or Wotan represents that notion of the god who rules, who commands, who people obey. And if you don't obey, the thunderbolts start coming. You're punished if you don't follow the moral edicts of Odin. And so unlike Alberic, who really has no power, Odin or Wotan in Valhalla is the place of immense divine power and those who dare to question him. But he's also willing to sell his birthright for power too, a much more subtle form of power. And the Freya, or we get our word Friday from Freya, she's the one who constantly nourishes the gods with the tree, the apple, and Yggdrasil is the great tree in Nordic myth. And so you get what's going on in the Rhine Maidens is two different understandings of power. One is political power, imperial power, the grandiose nature of divine power, the kingdom. And then this, of course, gets translated into human empires. If the ultimate is a king who has a kingdom, then we, if we're true to the ultimate, must have a kingdom too. We create our own Valhallas. And of course, what Wagner is doing is be very careful of the Alberics on one hand, who are low-level lusters after power, but beware of the subtler forms of power in which people use the language of the gods to justify building empires, defining justice in a certain way. And Wagner is going to go after this. And part of the whole story of the Ring of the Nibelung is be wary of the crude and the subtle approaches to power and how people lust after them for a variety of motives. And so Act 1, as it were, or night 1, because the Ring of the Nibelung was held over 4 nights, and so it's quite a drawn-out drama that is held in Bayreuth every year, but begins in the 19th century, mid-19th century, with Wagner's The Ring of the Nibelung. And so the Rhine Maiden, which really begins the story, is raising the questions of subtle power, crude power, Alberic, the nature of the ultimate. Can we really trust our understanding of the divine at an intellectual level, and then how it becomes applied at a political, a personal, an ecclesial, theological, exegetical level? And so this is an old issue, because just as in the early church, and even many of the Greek thinkers had to grapple with images of God, which was then called anthropomorphism. And so you have many images of God in the Bible, as in other religions, and to what degree are they what we would call projections of some of the best elements of ourselves and some of the worst elements of ourselves and some of the most mediocre elements of ourselves. And so the Old Testament, or the Hebrew canon, is replete with literally dozens and dozens of images of God, from king to shepherd to rock to lion to lamb, and we can go on and on with these multiple images. And how do we know what to choose from, when and why, and who is the real God in all of this? And so the Ring of the Nibelung, underneath everything, is a theological tract that works itself out sociologically in terms of the 19th century, questioning whose version of God are we talking about? And why are we to believe different interpretations of God? And if we can't believe any of them, what do we believe at the end of the day? And as the Ring of the Nibelung unfolds, without going into it in a lot of detail, which perhaps I can at another line, it's the Valkyries. They're the sort of the maidens of the divine, of Odin, who pick up those who are slain in battle. But one of Odin's dearest daughters, Brunhilde, she's the one who dares to question her father on some of his decisions regarding Sigmund, which was the father of Siegfried, who's later on in the story. And she'll have this clash then. What happens when you dare to differ with the ultimate, when you question the ultimate or a certain interpretation of the ultimate? Well, Brunhilde, essentially, as hard as it is for Wotan, he essentially, it's similar in many ways to what happens in Lord of the Rings in Arwen. She's willing to let go of her divinity or her ultimate standing for the purpose of love, of becoming human. But the clash between Wotan and Brunhilde, who is one of the, as it were, the queen of the Valkyries, she senses very clearly that, in fact, as the story unfolds, Sigmund and Sieglinde, his sister, in fact, they were sired by Wotan, and of course this certainly didn't please Wotan's wife Frigga. And of course what you have here in Nordic myth, as you do have in Greek myth with Zeus and Hera, they're projecting the nature of marriages and the tensions that occur and the clashes that occur. And so is this projection again? Well, very, very much what is going on in Nordic myth is they're projecting the reality of human struggles in the context of marriage, then they project it on the canvas of the eternal. But one of the tensions that begins to emerge very, very clearly is the children of Odin are beginning to question Odin's treatment of them, insisting that this is the way life must be. If you dare to question me, much less disobey me, there are serious consequences. And Thor comes out with his hammer, Donar he's called in the myths, and you get all of the Olympians in that sense who are defending a certain understanding of reality in Valhalla, turning on Brunhilde because she is asking meaningful questions about an understanding of the gods and how they treat humans, how they interact with one another. And so Brunhilde in this sense, even though Siegfried is important, Brunhilde is the real protagonist who interrogates, who dares to question, just like Prometheus in Greek myth. So in that sense, Brunhilde is the Prometheus of Greek myth. And Wagner is holding high, obviously, the role of women in something like this as well. So Siegfried plays a secondary role to Brunhilde in this. So the theological implications of the Ring of the Nibelung is such that these large 19th century, but they're not 19th century questions. As I mentioned earlier, they go right back to the beginnings of any sacred text or any understanding of how one attempts to interpret the relationship of God for humans and daring to question understandings of God. And that can work at two levels. One, if a person has an understanding that a read of God is real, then what happens when begins to question that understanding of God? And then sociologically, what happens when you have various groups that form little tribes and their different interpretations of God? What happens when those are questioned? Then you're seen as questioning God, him or herself. And so the Ring of the Nibelung is really at a deeper theological level about raising the questions that Friedrich Nietzsche is going to raise, in many ways that Marx is going to raise, that sociology is going to raise. And Wagner was a part of this, and Nietzsche was a part of this, raising at the larger intellectual level whose version of God, and obviously at a sociological level, the institutions, the communities that embody that view of God. The play, it goes through 4 acts. The first, as I mentioned, and I won't go into detail in any of them because this is just really a primer, a key in the ignition in that sense. The first one looks at the Rhine maidens. The second is the Valkyries, And then you begin to move into the third act, and the fourth is the twilight of the gods, the dying of the gods that have to die so that humans can fully come alive. And what Wagner's getting at, it's the humans who actually embody a greater divine understanding of love and are willing to sacrifice themselves to overcome human evil and certain understanding of divine evil that's sugar-coated in good, and they're willing to die for humans. And so the Brunhilde is willing to die for Siegfried, and out of that, what Wagner is arguing in the Twilight of the Gods, it's time for those understandings of the gods to die and for love to define what reality is. But that doesn't mean in attempting to do that the play is going to end well, because it doesn't end well. It ends tragically. And so, as it were, Siegfried and Brunhilde are put on the cross, but there is no resurrection. And I think to some degree this is what drew Nietzsche, is that he was very suspicious of a Hegelian-like positive ending, a dialectic. The history was moving in an optimistic direction. And Nietzsche and Wagner said, be wary of that simplistic, that naive approach when good people try to live meaningful and are willing to sacrifice their lives, as Brunhilde and Siegfried did, to bring about the good in the human context, as well as questioning a notion of the gods that had to die. And so very important as we live through the 20th and in the 21st century, and people still try and defend certain notions of the god, which are really about Odin, which are really about a Valhalla. And what Wagner is getting at, without going as far down the Nietzschean route, is that love is the most important thing. So what then is the relationship of human love and its relationship to divine love? And what's the nature of sacrifice itself? And Brunhilde and Siegfried, in that sense, are going to the cross, but they don't have the luxury of the resurrection that we get in certain Christian classics. In that sense, there's something deeply true about what they're empirically articulating through their stories in the Ring of the Nibelung. And we find the same thing in Wagner's grappling with this, in Lohengrin and Parsifal and many else. But maybe for another time I can get into each of the acts and unpack the subtle nature of the story that's being told by Wagner and its relevance for our time as well.